Now we have answer number 3 in the name of Rav Mori to reconcile the contradiction between the two prices of Reb Shimon as to whether or not Reb Shimon allows an onen to eat the korban pesach. Lo kasha. Kan shemeslo mes biyudalid ukvaro biyudalid. Kan shemeslo mes biyud gimel ukvaro biyudalid. In other words, are we dealing with Aninus Doraisa? Aninus Doraisa applies biyom misa ubiyom kvura. If both the misa and the kvura overlapped on the same day, that generates a shem onen with the isa achilus kodshim. However, in a case of meslo mes biyadal kvaro biyadalid yom misa tofes leila midaraisa, since we have Aninus Doraisa because on the 14th both his relative died and was buried. Therefore, the Laila following the 14th is also an extension of the Doraisa of the Iser Onen. But Meslo Mesbi Yud Gimel Kvar B'Yudalid, but says Rav Mori, if the Misa took place on one day and the Kvura on the next day, then Yom HaKvura Midrabanan. The second day is the Rabbanan. This is all based on a pasuk that says, "V'achrisa ki Yom Mar," and that Yom Mar, which is called Aninus, is achrisa. Achrisa means the end of life. So the termination of life of the relative is what generates Aninus Doraisa. But Yom Kvura, the Rabbanan extended the din of Onen to include even the next day in event that the mess was died yesterday but wasn't buried until today. And therefore, when the Rabbanan instituted a new category of Aninus on Yom Kvura, which is not the Yom HaMisa, they did not extend that to the Laila, Eino Tofes Leilo Elam Rabbanan. They would say the following, that since Yom HaKvur itself is the Rabbanan, the extension thereof to Laila after Kvura is likewise the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan suspended that Isa the Rabbanan for the sake of Achilas HaPesach. Amalei Rav Ashi Rav Mori Velahadik Tani Amal Rav Shimon Teda Sharei Amru Onein Tovil V'Ochel Et Pischo Avalo B'Kodshim Nemalei Ka'im Naloch Ana Yom Misa Doraisa V'Amet Liat Yom Kvura D'Rabbanan. I don't get it, says Rav Ashi. We have recorded in the Brisa the argument of Rabbi Shimon against Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Shimon says, wait a minute, how can you, Rabbi Yehuda, extend the Iser Doraisa of Aninus to the Laila and therefore exclude the Onen? What's going on over here? They said that Tovil Leochel Pischo, that he's allowed to use Korban Pesach. So I don't get it. According to Rav Mori, this counter argument of Rabbi Shimon makes no sense because Rabbi Yehuda just has to tell the following. When I said that the Onen can't eat the Korban Pesach on the Laila following his Aninus, I was talking about Yom Misa, meaning on the 14th, the relative died. And if the relative died on the 14th, Yom Misa, Achrisa Kiyomar, generates the Doraisa of Onen, and therefore the night following it is the Doraisa. But you're asking me a question from a case where the Misa took place on the 13th of Nisan and the Kvura on the 14th of Nisan, which means that the whole kit and caboodle of Aninus here to generate an Iser Kodshim on the 14th is all D'Rabbanan, and therefore the Laila that follows the 14th is only D'Rabbanan. Therefore, the Rabbanan will suspend that Isa D'Rabbanan for the sake of the great mitzvah of Achilas HaPesach. Kasha. Okay, now we get to number 4. Abaye. Abaye is going to introduce a very profound distinction here. Abaye Amar Lo Kasha. When Reb Shimon says that an Onen cannot eat the Korban Pesach, Kansha Meis Kodem Chatzos, he was already an Onen before the Shas Chiyuv Korban Pesach emerged. So let me give you a little bit of an introduction. Abaye is going to reconcile the contradiction in Reb Shimon, the two brises, based on a Talmudic principle, a very abstract Talmudic principle. Let me try to formulate that principle to the best of my ability. There's a difference between preventing the emergence of what we call a chalos, a new halachic status, as opposed to destroying that chalos once it already took effect. Therefore, mes kodem chatzos, and therefore the din of aninus and the iser achilas kodshim was chal, and there wasn't even a chiyuv korban pesach. That's going to be a case where you're not allowed to eat the korban pesach. Kan, where Rabbi Shimon was making, and he said the only is allowed to eat from the korban pesach, shemesli achar chatzos, the chiyuv korban pesach preempted the chal shem aninus. So the aninus, which now wants to come to jump and generate an isur and be mafkia and remove and uproot the chiyuv pesach, can't do so. If the aninus was chal before chatzos, because the mitzvah of korban pesach is chal with chatzos, then the mitzvah of korban pesach cannot override the isur aninus that already grabbed, was already validated, already emerged as a halachic entity. But if the mess died after this relative was chayev in the korban pesach because the mess died after chatzos on 14, then the isur aninus cannot come and undermine the preemptive chalos of chiyuv korban, of chiyuv pesach. Kodem chatzos lo chazi lePesach. There was no chiyuv pesach before chatzos. It's like the rest of the year. Is chayla leaninus. The aninus is chal because the mess died and it's not yet chatzos. But achar chatzos is the mess died after chatzos. And now you want to generate and be machadesh an iser onen on a pre-existing echazi lepesach lo chayla leaninus. Aninus doesn't have the power to undermine, to destroy, and completely invalidate a chiyuv korban pesach that already emerged. Wow, that's Abai. I have a feeling that the logic of Abai is going to reverberate throughout the halachic literature. We know Tamra. I need a proof, says Abai. So how do I know this? Desani, I learned it from a brisa. Oh, whoa. Steve, take a deep breath because we're going to learn a brisa that has many, many parts to it. And the common denominator of all these parts is, number one, that they're all halachas derived from the same pasuk that has many, many different parts to it in Vayikra Chaf Aleph. And number two, that all of them are dealing with the question of a conflict between two great mitzvahs. One mitzvah is kfura, to bury the dead, and the other mitzvah is korban pesach. Now, the reason why they're at conflict and loggerheads is because if the halacha will mandate that he get involved in burying the dead, then he becomes tameh. And if he's tameh, he's excluded from kodshim. He's excluded from korban pesach. So what is going to win out? So let's read the pasuk. The pasuk says, "La'achoso habsula hakrova elav ashalo haisalish lo yitameh." So we're now combining two different parashas. One parsha is in Vayikra Chaf Aleph, the other parsha is in Bamidbar Perek, I think it's Vav, if I read it correctly, which is dealing with a Nazir. Now, a Nazir is unique. And even though a Kohen is not permitted to contract tumah, but yet nevertheless for the burial of his dead, he's allowed to the beginning of Parshas Emor. But Nazir is more chamor in Parshas Naso. And a Nazir will not desecrate his Kedushas Nazirus and be metame himself even for the sake of the Kvura of his close relatives. In that sense, a Nazir is very similar to Kohen Gadol. So what are we going to do with the pasuk of lachoso, etc., lo yitame? So now we're not talking, again, this is in Vayikra, so we're not talking about a Nazir. Nazir is in Bamidbar, but rather a Kohen. So the Kohen's sister died, and the Torah says, Lo Yitame, he should be Mitame himself. In other words, he has to bury his sister. Mitzvah. Now, whether it's a mitzvah or a het is going to be machlokas tanoim later on in this sugi. Right now, the Bryce is maintaining that it's a mitzvah, which I believe is Rabbi Akiva's shita. So the Kohen doesn't have a right to prava frumkeit, if you pardon the expression, and say, oh, I don't want to be mitame. I'm a Kohen and I'm not allowed to be mitame. No. He's obligated to be mitame because of the great mitzvah of kvura. And therefore, lo rotza mitame also balkoch. If he refuses, then we'll force him against his will to be mitame. We'll push him against the mess. And that actually happened historically. Maisa b'Yosef HaKohen, Meisa ishto b'erev Pesach, v'lo rotza litame. Now, he had a mistake. This Yosef HaKohen, no offense to Yosef HaKohen, but he thought that an One is allowed to eat from a Korban Pesach, but a Tomei is not allowed to eat from a Korban Pesach. He didn't want to be Mitame himself, even though he's an One, and anyway he can't eat from the Korban Pesach. That he didn't realize. He thought, no, the problem will be if he buries the who was it that died, his wife, then he'll be Tomei. And if he contracts Tumah, he can't bring the Korban Pesach. Nimnu Echav, all the Kohanim, fellow Kohanim got up and they took a vote. V'timu bal kocha, and they forced him against his will. They pushed him against the mess, against the beer, B-I-E-R, right? Okay. Now, the Gemara is going to shift, I should say the Bryce actually, is going to shift its attention to the Pasuk in Bamidbar. And that pasuk says, "Li'aviv li'imel achiv v'lachot," so lo yitamim b'hem. Now, why did the Torah have to specify each one of his relatives in and of it, specifically? And the answer is that in each case, we're going to either use the extra pasuk to teach me that he should contaminate himself for the sake of the burial, or that he should not contaminate. For example, la'chosu matamid lomar, harish alach lishchoris pischa v'lomas b'no v'shom shemeis lomes yochel yitame. Amrit lo yitame. Right, you might think that since there's a general mitzvah of kvura, which entails that he contracts tumah, and even if he's on his way to Shechtas Pesach or to be mal his son, he should be metame for the sake of the mitzvah of kvura and forfeit the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, forfeit the mitzvah of milah. Yochel yitame, amrit lo yitame. He should not involve himself in the mitzvah of kvura, because in doing so, he will undermine his possibility of these two great mitzvahs, the two scenarios. And therefore the Torah says lo yitame. Lo yitame means do not contract tumah for the sake of the mitzvah of burying the dead, because the mitzvah of Korban Pesach overrides the mitzvah of Kvura. Yochel kshem shelo yitame lachoso kach ena mitame lemes mitzvah. If you're saying that the mitzvah of Kvura in the case of a close relative is going to be suspended for the sake of Korban Pesach, forget about Kvura because we don't want you to become Tomei and forfeit the mitzvah of Korban Pesach, then I might think that even if there's a mess lying there and there's no one to bury the dead, which is called a mess mitzvah, so you're going to say, well, I got Korban Pesach on my head. I forget about the mitzvah of Kvura. Talmud lomar ulachosa lachosa hu diena mitame aval mitame hu mes mitzvah. So for mes mitzvah we will suspend the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. That's how great the mitzvah of mes mitzvah is, and that's it. Now, the entire brisa assumes that the onen is chayav to bring his Korban Pesach. The previous brisa seem to assume that an onen is not obligated. Says Abai, how do we reconcile this? Lav shmamina, don't we have to deduce from this contradiction that kan kodem chatzos, kan liacher chatzos? The only way I could reconcile this contradiction in the two brisos as to whether or not he's obligated in the Korban Pesach or not, it all depends upon when his relative died. If his relative died before chatzos, then he's already an onen, and the mitzvah of Korban Pesach does not undermine the mitzvah that's already chal of aninus. But liacher chatzos, if on the other hand the mitzvah of Korban Pesach emerged first, and then only subsequently the aninus is chal, then we're going to say that he has to bring the Korban Pesach, and even though he's an onen. So Gemara says, Mimai, you know what? I don't think that that's the only way of reconciling this contradiction of the Brisa. Okay, it was after Chatzos. So how do we reconcile the stira? Ha Rabbi Shmuel, v'ha Rabbi Akiva. Let's see what's machlok between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel. This Sanya we learned to the Brisa. Lo yitama rishus. Divrei Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel holds the entire entity of obligating a relative to bury his close relative is all just a heter. He's allowed to do so. And even though he has Kedushas Kahuna, which generates an Isa of Mitame, we're going to allow it. The Torah says we'll allow it. But that's called the Rishos. So therefore, according to Rabbi Shmuel, we would not push him against the beer of the dead in order to Mitame him for the sake of Kvura, because it's only Rishos. He could decide one way or the other. It's up to his discretion. Which is a pella when you think about Rabbi Shmuel. I don't know. I'd like to reinterpret Rabbi Shmuel if I could. He goes even a step further. He says the same thing applies not just to a Kohen who has a problem of being Matami, but even to a non-Kohen. He's not obligated to bury his close relative. Rabbi Akiva Omer Chova. Rabbi Akiva says the Torah requires him to bury the dead. So therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva, we understand very well that, we can raise the question of whether or not the obligation to bury your close relative overrides the Korban Pesach, or it doesn't. According to Rabbi Shmuel, for sure, it wouldn't override, and he has to bring the Korban Pesach. Rabbi Akiva might say, no, don't bring the Korban Pesach because you have an obligation to bury the dead. It's a mitzvah, it's a chova. I'll just quickly read his footnote here. I know we're running out of time with how we're doing. Okay, we still have a few more minutes. Abai assumed that both brisos agree with Reb Shimon's premise that an onen is also to karbonos. The only difference between them is whether or not the prohibition will override the Korban Pesach or not. So the first brisa, where it became an onen before the chiyuv of Korban Pesach emerged, therefore the aninus cannot be pushed off by or overridden by the Korban Pesach obligation. The second brisa says Abai is a case in which the Pesach obligation took place first because the mess died after Chatzos. Now the Gemara is suggesting that forget about Rabbi Shimon. Both brisos agree that there are no restrictions against an onen from bringing korbanos. An onen is obligated to bring his korban Pesach, even in a case where the mess died before Chatzos and the aninus was chal. The difference between two brises revolves not around the question of whether or not, the chiyuv haninus came first, the chiyuv korban Pesach first, and which would be docha which. No. It's all about the mitzvah of kfura. The first brisa, following in the footsteps of Rabbi Akiva, holds that there's a mitzvah, and that mitzvah is going to, right, to bury the dead, is going to override the chiyuv korban Pesach. Right, even in a case where the mess died after Chatzos. Okay, now he has a whole discussion here about Pesach Sheni. I don't know. I think in the limited amount of time we have for Daf Yomi, I think we'll leave out. Again, it's very important, but it's complicated. Anyway, Lo Salkadait. The Gemara says it's impossible. You can't tell me that one brisa follows Rabbi Shmuel, and there's no chiyuv mitzvah of kfura, and therefore Korban Pesach takes precedence. Because the Reisha Dahi Rabbi Akiva Ketani, I'm going to prove to you from that same structured brisa that the brisa is explicitly quoting Rabbi Akiva. So you can't introduce Rabbi Shmuel. The Sanya, it says in the brisa, Rabbi Akiva Omer, Nefesh Elu Hakrovim. So the Torah says that a Nazir is enjoined from contaminating himself for a nefesh, and it's referring to krovim, because a nazir is excluded from burial of even his closest relatives. And Meis Elu Archokim, since it says both nefesh and mes is referring to a general, therefore nefesh is referring even to his relative. Li aviv eina mitame. So why did the Torah have to specify aviv? If you're telling me that a nazir is not allowed to override his nazirus and be metame himself to contaminate himself for any kfura of his, so why do you have to specify aviv? Aviv is going to tell you that there is a case where even a nazir who's enjoined from being metame himself for the kfura of his close relatives is allowed to be metame himself for the sake of what? Mes mitzvah. Now, okay, he's a nazir. What happens if he's also a Kohen? And now he has an overlap of two Kedushos, both of which generate an Isur Tumah, and that's going to be Le'imo. Haya Kohen vu Nazir, Le'imo eno Metame, av Metame hu Lemes Mitzvah. Li'achiv, another extra word in the Pasuk, Haya Kohen Gadol vu Nazir. He's got the two highest levels of Kedusha that could possibly exist on the globe. He's not just a regular Kohen. He's not just a Nazir. He's also to beat the Kohen Gadol. And the Kohen Gadol is not allowed to bury any of his close relatives, just like a Nazir. But Li'achiv is coming to teach me that Li'achiv ain't in the time lemes mitzvah. So you could be a Nazir, you could be a Kohen Gadol, and you will be metame yourself to bury a mes mitzvah. Lachoso matamad lomar, and this we saw before. Hareish olach lishodes pisol lomas pno v'shomish meisol mes yochol yitame. I might think that he should forfeit the great mitzvah, the Korban Pesach, for the sake of burying his dead. Now we're not talking about a Nazir. Is Amrit lo yitam. Korban Pesach takes precedence. He'll have to find someone else to bury the dead. Yochel kshem she'eda mitame lachoso kakeda mitame lemes mitzvah tam lo lachoso lo yitame av yitame hu lemes mitzvah.